Hi everyone, I'm here to help you today. I know you watched this video to help you fall asleep, so before you drift off, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, settle in, get cozy, and relax with me. Let's start. Sarah and I had always dreamed of owning a Victorian house. When we found the listing for 47 Maple Street, with its weathered gables and wraparound porch, it seemed too good to be true. The price was well within our budget, suspiciously so, looking back, and the realtor was eager to close the deal. Perhaps we should have questioned why such a magnificent property was priced so modestly, but love has a way of clouding judgment. The house stood at the end of a quiet street in a small New England town, its faded blue paint peeling like old memories ready to be shed. Towering oak trees flanked the property, their branches creating intricate shadows that danced across the lawn. The previous owners had left abruptly, we were told, due to a job relocation. Their furniture still occupied some rooms, covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. "It's perfect," Sarah whispered when we first walked through the creaking front door. Her eyes sparkled as she took in the original hardwood floors, the ornate crown molding, and the grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. I had to agree. It was everything we'd hoped for in our first home together. The moving process was straightforward enough. We spent the first few days painting walls, replacing light fixtures, and making the space our own. The house seemed to respond positively to our presence, as if awakening from a long slumber. The autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows, warming the rooms and casting golden patterns on the walls. It was during our first week that we discovered the journal. Sarah was cleaning out the built-in bookshelf in the study when she found it wedged behind a loose panel. The leather-bound book was weathered, its pages yellow with age. Inside, dated entries spanning from 1987 to 1988 detailed the experiences of a previous owner, Elizabeth Chun. "Listen to this," Sarah said, perching on the window seat. "October 15th, 1987. The music box in the attic played again today. I know I didn't wind it. James says I'm imagining things, but I know what I heard. The melody is always the same, a lullaby I can't quite place." I shrugged it off as the imaginings of a previous owner, but Sarah became fascinated with Elizabeth's writings. She spent evenings poring over the journal, occasionally reading passages aloud that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Elizabeth wrote about cold spots that appeared and disappeared, about objects that moved on their own, and about dreams that felt more like memories of events she'd never experienced. The first incident we couldn't explain happened 3 weeks after we moved in. I was working late in the study, grading papers for my high school English class, when I heard piano music drifting up from the first floor. The notes were hesitant, like someone picking out a melody they half remembered. I assumed Sarah was playing on the old upright in the living room, though I didn't know she could play. When I went downstairs to investigate, the living room was empty. The piano stood silent, its yellowed keys untouched. Sarah was already in bed, reading. "I thought you were playing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up from her book, confused. "I don't play piano. You know that." We both heard the music after that, always late at night, always the same fragmentary melody. Sometimes it was accompanied by the sound of footsteps on the stairs, though we never saw anyone. Sarah began to document our experiences in her own journal, drawing parallels between what was happening to us and what Elizabeth had written about 30 years earlier. The dreams started next. They weren't nightmares exactly, but they left us both unsettled. In mine, I was always searching for something in the house. Opening doors, looking under furniture, checking behind walls. I never knew what I was looking for, but the sense of urgency was overwhelming. Sarah's dreams were more specific. She dreamed of a young woman in a blue dress, sitting at the piano, endlessly practicing the same piece of music. One morning, Sarah woke up crying. "She's so sad," she said when I asked what was wrong. "She's been waiting so long." "Who has?" "Emily, the girl in the blue dress." I hadn't told Sarah about my research, but I'd been digging into the house's history. There had been an Emily Sullivan, the daughter of the house's original owners. She died in 1912 at the age of 19. According to newspaper archives, she'd been a promising pianist who died under mysterious circumstances. The article mentioned that she was found at the piano. Sheet music for an unfinished composition spread before her. The activity in the house intensified after that. Objects would move when we weren't looking. We'd find all the doors open in the morning, though we'd closed them the night before. The piano music became louder, more insistent. Sometimes we'd hear what sounded like someone running up and down the stairs, their footsteps urgent and heavy. Sarah became convinced that Emily was trying to communicate with us. She started leaving sheet music on the piano, hoping to encourage some kind of interaction. I remained skeptical, but I couldn't deny that something strange was happening in our home. The turning point came on a cold November night. We'd been in the house for 2 months, and the activity had reached a fever pitch. The piano music had been playing for hours, louder than ever before. Sarah sat in the living room, watching the keys move on their own, while I paced nervously behind her. Suddenly, the music stopped. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and we could see our breath in the air. Sarah stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on a point near the piano. I couldn't see anything, but I felt a presence, something old and sad and desperate to be heard. "She wants to finish it," Sarah whispered. "The composition. She never got to finish it." What happened next defies explanation. Sarah walked to the piano and sat down. Though she'd never played before, her fingers found the keys with certainty. The melody that emerged was the same one we'd been hearing for weeks, but this time it continued past the point where it usually stopped. Sarah played for nearly an hour, her hands moving as if guided by an invisible force. When she finished, she was crying, but smiling. "It's done," she said simply. "She can rest now." The house felt different after that night. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the strange occurrences gradually ceased. We still hear the piano occasionally, but it's distant now, like an echo of a memory. The song Sarah played that night, Emily's final composition, was eventually published. Music scholars were fascinated by its complexity and emotional depth. Sharon Miller hadn't meant to take the late bus. The 11:45 p.m. from Portland to Augusta wasn't her usual route, but the conference had run long, and her car was in the shop again. As she climbed aboard the nearly empty Greyhound, a chill ran down her spine despite the muggy August heat. The bus driver didn't look up as she showed her ticket. His weathered face remained fixed on some distant point through the windshield, hands gripping the wheel though the engine wasn't even running. Sharon made her way down the aisle, past an elderly woman clutching a cat carrier and a businessman absorbed in his phone. She chose a seat near the middle, away from the handful of other passengers. At 35, Sharon had spent enough time on the road as a pharmaceutical sales rep to know the unwritten rules of late-night bus travel. Minimal eye contact, headphones in, and stay alert. The divorce 6 months ago had forced her to take more late routes like this one. The custody arrangement with Mark meant she had to cram her sales calls into fewer days, often working late to compensate. The familiar diesel rumble filled the air as they pulled out of the station. Through the grimy window, Sharon watched Portland's lights fade into the darkness of rural Maine. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, suburban sprawl giving way to dense forest on both sides. She checked her phone. No signal. Of course. Sharon pulled out her phone again, hoping to distract herself with some mindless scrolling. The screen flickered to life, but something was wrong with the display. The time showed 1:47 a.m., but that couldn't be right. They'd only been on the road for about half an hour. And the date? The date showed August 15th, but today was definitely the 14th. That's when she noticed something odd about the reflections in her window. The businessman's face looked wrong somehow. In the glass, his features seemed to shift and flow like wax, eyes too dark and mouth too wide. Sharon blinked hard and looked back directly at him. Normal. Just a tired-looking middle-aged man in a rumpled suit. She was letting her imagination run wild. The elderly woman's cat started to yowl, a sound that raised the hair on Sharon's arms. It wasn't the usual angry cat-and-carrier cry, but something almost human. The woman whispered soothingly to it, but her own voice seemed to waver and distort. "Hush now, precious. We're almost there." Almost there. A memory surfaced, unwanted. 3 years ago, working this same territory, she'd heard stories from local doctors about patients who'd gone missing along this stretch of highway. The police had dismissed it. People leave, people run away. especially from small towns. But one elderly doctor, close to retirement and too tired to care about sounding crazy, had told her something different. "It's the night roads," he'd said, hands shaking slightly as he signed for her samples. "They change after midnight. My grandfather used to tell me stories about routes that aren't on any map, buses that never reach their destination." The overhead lights began to flicker, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of the bus's motion. Sharon gripped her armrest tighter, knuckles white. Through the window, she could no longer see any other traffic on the highway. No distant farmhouse lights. Nothing but the endless trees and the increasingly strange reflections in the glass. She checked her watch. 12:15 a.m. They should be approaching the Augusta outskirts, but the forest pressing in on both sides looked unfamiliar. The trees seemed too tall, too close to the road. Their branches reached over the highway like grasping fingers, blotting out the stars. The cat's cries grew louder, more desperate. Sharon noticed the businessman had put down his phone. He was staring straight ahead, face blank, too blank, like a mask. "Next stop," the driver announced suddenly, his voice crackling through the speakers. But that couldn't be right. They were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town. The bus began to slow. Sharon's heart pounded as they pulled onto a narrow shoulder. Through the trees, she could just make out what looked like an old bus shelter, a simple metal overhang thick with rust and ivy. No lights, no sign, nothing to indicate an official stop. The elderly woman stood, gathering her carrier. The cat had gone silent. "Ma'am," Sharon called out, her voice shaking slightly. "I don't think this is a real stop. We're not anywhere near." The woman turned, and Sharon's words died in her throat. In the dim overhead lights, the old woman's face was melting, skin dripping like candle wax to reveal something dark and chitinous underneath. The businessman stood too, his suit rippling as though filled with crawling insects. Sharon lunged for the emergency exit handle, but her fingers passed right through it like smoke. The driver's reflection in the rearview mirror showed only empty space where his face should be. "Last stop," he announced again, his voice no longer human. Everyone off. Panic surged through Sharon's veins as she scrambled over the back of her seat, away from the advancing figures. The businessman's suit had split open now, revealing a writhing mass of darkness beneath. The old woman's cat carrier had transformed into something that looked like a cage made of bones, containing nothing but shadows and clicking sounds. The bus's interior began to stretch and distort, the aisle growing longer, the windows warping into impossible shapes. Sharon stumbled toward the back, her feet suddenly heavy as though moving through thick mud. The air had become dense, carrying the smell of wet earth and decay. "You can't leave," the thing that had been the businessman said, its voice a chorus of whispers. "No one leaves the midnight route." Sharon's back hit the rear emergency door. Through the window, she could see the bus shelter had changed too. It was larger now, its metal frame twisting up into the trees like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. Dark figures moved beneath it, their forms suggesting shapes that human minds were never meant to comprehend. The driver stood from his seat, unfolding into something tall and spindly, his uniform falling away to reveal glossy black segments like an insect's carapace. "We have been collecting passengers for centuries," it said, mandibles clicking. "The night roads are our hunting grounds. The midnight routes are snares." Sharon's mind raced through her sales routes, all those late-night drives, all those missing person reports she'd glimpsed in local papers. How many others had taken the last bus? How many had disappeared into whatever nightmare realm waited at that final stop? The emergency handle felt solid now beneath her fingers. Whatever force had made it intangible before had weakened as the beings revealed their true forms. Sharon gripped it tight, her other hand finding the small canister of pepper spray she always carried in her jacket pocket. The creature that had been the old woman reached for her with hands that were now long, jointed things like spiders' legs. "Join us," it chittered. "Become part of the midnight route. Forever." Sharon yanked the emergency handle and sprayed the pepper spray in a wide arc. The creatures recoiled, their forms wavering like heat mirages. She didn't wait to see more. She threw herself backward through the emergency door, hitting the ground hard and rolling into the ditch beside the road. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, but Sharon forced herself to her feet. She ran into the forest, away from the bus shelter and its waiting horrors. Branches whipped at her face as she crashed through the underbrush. Behind her, she could hear inhuman screams and the sound of many-legged things pursuing through the trees. She ran until her legs burned and her lungs felt like they would burst. When she finally stopped, gasping for air, the forest around her had changed. The trees were normal-sized again, their branches no longer reaching like claws. In the distance, she could see the lights of what looked like a gas station. Sharon's phone buzzed in her pocket. Signal had returned. The screen showed 12:30 a.m., August 14th. She pulled up her Maps app with trembling fingers. She was only 3 miles outside of Augusta, somehow. As she walked toward the gas station's lights, Sharon thought about all the routes she'd have to change now, all the night drives she'd have to rearrange. She thought about the missing persons reports she'd start collecting, looking for patterns, for others who might have taken the midnight route. Most of all, she thought about the old doctor's words, about roads that change after midnight. She thought about how many other bus routes might run through the dark places of the world, collecting passengers for things that hunted along the night roads. The next morning, the Augusta Greyhound station would report that the 11:45 p.m. bus from Portland had arrived on schedule, completely empty. The driver would have no memory of any passengers, and the security cameras would show Sharon Miller boarding in Portland but never arriving in Augusta. But Sharon knew she'd escaped. She also knew they would be watching for her now, waiting on every midnight route, every dark highway. And sometimes, on late nights when she can't avoid driving, she still catches glimpses in her rearview mirror, faces that shift like wax, and empty bus shelters that seem to reach for the sky. David Chun had been working at the Riverside Extended Stay Hotel for 6 months when room 410 started to change people. Not in any way you'd notice right away. The changes were subtle at first. A business traveler would check in for a week, perfectly normal, and check out with a slight tremor in their left hand. A vacationing couple would arrive happy and leave with hollow eyes and matching nervous tics. David noticed because it was his job to notice. After his failed career as an art history professor, cut short by budget cuts and department politics, the night manager position hadn't been his first choice. But 3 years of unemployment had taught him to take what he could get. Besides, the night shift suited his insomnia, giving him plenty of quiet hours to work on his never-finished book about the intersection of art and madness in the early 20th century. The hotel itself was unremarkable, a 4-story brick building just off I-95, catering to business travelers and families looking for budget accommodations. Room 410 was equally standard, queen bed, generic furnishings, the same cheap prints on the walls as every other room, except for the landscape painting on the far wall. At first glance, it was nothing special. A woodland scene, all soft blues and gentle greens, a stream winding through summer trees. Hotel art at its most forgettable. But lately, David had started to wonder about that painting. He first noticed something was truly wrong when Mrs. Henderson checked in. She was a retired schoolteacher, staying while her house was being renovated. Sweet lady brought him homemade cookies on her second day. Said the room was perfect. Loved the peaceful view. On day 3, she mentioned the children playing in the painting. Such happy little ones, she'd said, her smile just a bit too wide. They wave to me at night. Want me to come play with them? There had never been any children in that painting. David had cleaned that room hundreds of times, stared at that bland landscape while changing sheets and vacuuming. Just trees, water, and sky. No figures at all. By day 5, Mrs. Henderson's gray hair had gone completely white. Her hands shook constantly, and her eyes seemed to follow things that weren't there. She checked out early, leaving behind a room that smelled of wet leaves and soil, though it hadn't rained in weeks. The incident nagged at David's academic mind. He began documenting changes in room 410's guests, keeping detailed notes in a leather-bound journal he'd once intended for research observations. The pattern was undeniable. Mr. Rossi, the traveling salesman who started talking to his reflection in the bathroom mirror, insisting it was showing him the other side of the trees, found on his last morning, pressing his face against the painting's surface, whispering about the way through. The young couple, the Andersons, who stopped sleeping entirely. Security footage showed them spending nights standing motionless beneath the painting, hands clasped, heads tilted as if listening to distant music. They left without checking out, abandoning all their belongings except a sketchbook filled with drawings of childlike figures dancing between dark trees. Jenny Martinez, the teenage girl who took photos of the room for her travel blog. Her phone's memory was corrupted, every image showing dark shapes moving between the trees, getting closer to the frame in each shot. The final photo showed what looked like small handprints pressed against the inside of the picture. Each incident left its mark on the room. The wallpaper began to feel damp to the touch near the painting. The carpet developed strange patterns that looked like footprints when viewed from certain angles. The mirror started showing reflections that moved a fraction of a second too slowly. David tried removing the painting once. He waited until the room was vacant, brought his tools, and carefully lifted it from the wall. The frame was heavier than it should have been, and the wall behind it felt cold, like a window left open in winter. He took it to his office, locked it in the supply closet. The next morning, the painting was back in room 410. The replacement artwork he'd hung was shredded into tiny pieces that spelled out "wrong window" on the carpet. The supply closet was locked, exactly as he'd left it, but filled with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. Disturbed but intrigued, David began researching the hotel's history. The building records led him to a discovery that made his blood run cold. The hotel had been constructed on the former grounds of Riverside Asylum, closed in 1963 after a series of mysterious patient deaths. Diving deeper into the asylum's records, David found what he was looking for. Elizabeth Marsh, admitted in 1961. She had been a prominent local artist, known for her eerily realistic landscapes. Her breakdown came after the disappearance of her 3 children during a painting expedition in the woods. The police never found any bodies, but Elizabeth's behavior became increasingly erratic. Her admission records noted an obsession with doorways between worlds, and her insistence that her paintings were becoming portals. The asylum staff had encouraged her art therapy, seeing it as harmless, until other patients began reporting strange experiences around her works. They claimed to hear children's laughter coming from her landscapes, see movement in the trees she painted. The final entry in Elizabeth's file, dated just before the asylum's closure, described her last painting, a woodland scene with a stream. The same night she completed it, Elizabeth vanished from her locked room. The staff found only her art supplies and the fresh painting on the wall, still wet in places though she'd had no paint left. The more David read, the more certain he became. The painting in room 410 was Elizabeth's final work. Somehow, during the asylum's demolition and the hotel's construction, it had survived, found its way into the building's decoration. And it was still active, still serving its intended purpose, whatever that might be. He began spending his breaks in room 410 when it was vacant, watching the painting for hours. The changes were subtle at first. Shadows that grew longer against the rules of perspective, leaves that trembled without a breeze, water that seemed to flow uphill. But the longer he watched, the more he saw. Sometimes he caught glimpses of faces in the foliage, pale, curious faces that reminded him of Elizabeth's photographs in the asylum records. Once, he saw 3 small figures dancing by the stream, their laughter like distant wind chimes. They waved to him, called him by name, though he'd never told them what it was. The dream started then. In them, David walked through those painted woods, feeling soft grass under his feet, hearing the stream's gentle murmur. Each dream took him deeper, past the trees in the foreground, following the water's winding path. The children were always just ahead, playing their eternal games of hide and seek, calling him further in. He started taking extra shifts, spending more time near room 410. The hotel manager, Linda, noticed his dedication and offered him a promotion to day shift supervisor. David declined. He couldn't leave now, not when he was so close to understanding. The guest's changes accelerated, as if the painting knew it had found a willing observer. A businessman checked in for one night and had to be carried out catatonic, his eyes fixed on something far away, hands curled into claws. His last coherent words were about the children who need a new teacher. A honeymoon couple, the Wilsons, vanished completely, leaving only wet footprints that led from the bed to the painting and stopped. Their suitcases remained untouched, except for a note written in Mrs. Wilson's hand. We see why Elizabeth did it. They just wanted to play. David watched the security footage obsessively, though the camera in 410 never worked right. The images always came through distorted, showing impossible angles and periods of complete darkness. But sometimes, in those dark frames, he caught glimpses. Figures moving in ways bodies shouldn't move, shadows that reached like hands, and always, the painting glowing softly in the background. Linda tried to talk to him about his growing obsession. She'd noticed the changes in him, the weight loss, the distracted manner, the way he'd stand in 410's doorway for hours, just staring at the painting. She suggested he take some vacation time, get some rest. David nodded, agreed, and kept watching. He started visiting the room during vacant periods, sitting in the chair by the window, watching the painted landscape slowly shift. The trees grew darker, their branches reaching like fingers. The stream began to look less like water and more like something flowing the wrong way, something thick and dark. The children appeared to him more clearly now, no longer hiding behind the trees. They played their games, sang their songs, and told him stories about Elizabeth, how she'd found them in the real woods, seen them dancing, and wanted to give them a forever home in her art. How she joined them eventually, becoming their mother again in a world where time didn't pass and no one ever had to grow up. But Elizabeth had grown tired over the years. The children needed someone new to watch over them, to keep the door open between their world and ours. They'd been waiting for someone who could really see them, understand them. Someone like David. He understood now why Elizabeth had painted this door. Not out of madness, but out of love. The children needed a guardian, someone to watch over their eternal games, to keep the door open between their world and ours. Elizabeth had grown too old, too tired. They needed someone new. On his last night, David came to room 410 with his research journal and a small bag of personal items. He'd left his resignation letter on Linda's desk, along with his unfinished manuscript about art and madness. Now he understood, you couldn't truly write about such things from the outside. The painting had changed completely by then, showing a deeper forest than before, full of impossible colors and shifting shadows. The children danced at its edge, their faces alight with joy at his arrival. Behind them, in a clearing by the stream, he could see Elizabeth, young again, smiling and holding out her hand. David stepped forward, pressing his palm against the canvas. It felt cool and liquid, like still water. The children's voices were clear now, their laughter bright and real. As he pushed through, he felt the paint flow around him, not wet but alive, pulling him gently into that other world. The hotel staff found room 410 empty the next morning, perfectly made up as always. The painting hung in its usual place, showing its usual peaceful scene. But now, if you looked carefully, you might notice a new figure among the trees. A man in modern clothes, walking hand in hand with laughing children, leading them deeper into the painted woods. Linda hired a new night manager. The painting remained, and room 410 continued to change its guests. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, you can hear children's laughter echoing through the halls. And if you look at the painting just right, you might see David Chan smiling back at you. Forever young, forever watching over his charges in that other world beyond the frame. But whatever you do, don't look too long. Don't let them see you watching. And if they wave, if they call your name, if they invite you to join their games, close your eyes, turn away, and remember, not all windows are meant to be opened. Not all paintings are meant to be doors. And sometimes, the most dangerous art isn't what you can see on the canvas, but what can see you back. In her office, Linda keeps David's journal locked in her desk. Sometimes, late at night, she takes it out and reads his final entry. I understand now. It's not about escape or madness. It's about finding where you truly belong. The children are waiting. Elizabeth is waiting. And the painting has always been waiting for someone who could really see. Tommy found the box while cleaning out his grandmother's attic after the funeral. It was old, made of dark wood with brass fittings, about the size of a shoebox. No lock, just a simple latch. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, sat a single glass marble that seemed to swirl with its own inner light. His mother had warned him not to go through Grandma Rose's things alone. She kept things, Mom had said, her voice tight, things that should stay buried. But Tommy was 32 years old, for Christ's sake, and his grandmother had been just a sweet old lady who baked cookies and collected too many cats. The marble felt warm when he picked it up, like it had been sitting in sunlight, though the attic was cold and dark. As he rolled it between his fingers, the swirling colors seemed to form patterns, faces, places, memories that weren't his own. He saw a young woman in a blue dress, running through summer grass. He saw the same woman years later, her face twisted in fear as she held something in her cupped hands. He saw things that slithered and crawled at the edges of reality, waiting to be remembered. Tommy tried to put the marble down, but his fingers wouldn't release it. The memories kept coming, faster now. Grandmother Rose hadn't been the benign collector of trinkets and teller of tales he'd known. She'd been a keeper of something ancient, a guardian of doors that were never meant to be opened. And now, with her death, the contents of her memory box were looking for a new home. The first complete memory hit him like a thunderbolt. He was there, in his grandmother's body, barely 18 years old, standing in a moonlit clearing. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, something ancient and musty, like old books left too long in a damp basement. Before her stood a circle of standing stones, each one carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. In her hands, his hands, she held the marble. But it wasn't just a marble then. It pulsed with a blue-green light that matched the shimmer between the stones. An old woman stood beside her, her great-grandmother Eleanor, speaking words in a language that made his teeth ache. "The women in our family have always been the guardians," Eleanor was saying. "Since before the old world fell, since before the new gods came. We keep the memories safe. We keep the doors closed." The scene shifted. Now he was Rose at 25, cradling her newborn daughter, Tommy's mother, while the marble glowed on the nightstand. Shadows gathered in the corners of the hospital room, reaching with tendrils of darkness toward the baby. Rose's hand shot out, grabbed the marble, and the shadows retreated, hissing in voices that spoke of ancient hungers. Another shift. Rose at 40, standing in her kitchen while Tommy's mother, now a teenager, screamed at her. "You're crazy. All these rules, all these secrets. I want nothing to do with it." The marble sat between them on the kitchen table, its surface clouded and dark. "You don't understand," Rose pleaded. "It's our responsibility. The memories must be kept. If they get loose, I don't care. Keep your crazy traditions. I'm done." Tommy gasped as his own consciousness surfaced briefly. He was on his knees in the attic, sweat soaking his shirt despite the cold. The marble burned against his palm, eager to show him more. He tried again to drop it, but his fingers remained locked around its smooth surface. The memories dragged him under again. Now he saw what the marble truly was, not just a repository of family memories, but a seal, a lock. Inside it swirled the collected memories of centuries, yes, but also the knowledge of things that existed in the spaces between spaces. Ancient beings that had once ruled the world, that had been pushed back by humans but never truly defeated. Beings that hungered for mankind's memories, their experiences, their very souls. The women in his family had been tasked with keeping these entities at bay. The marble was both key and locked to a door that must never be opened. Each guardian added her own memories to the marble, strengthening its power, while also taking on the burden of containing what lay behind that mystic door. But his mother had rejected the responsibility, and now Rose was gone. Tommy saw his grandmother's last days through her own eyes. She knew she was dying, knew she needed to pass on the guardianship, but to whom? Her own daughter had refused the calling, and Tommy, her only grandchild, was male. In all the centuries of guardians, there had never been a male keeper. Yet as her strength failed, Rose had made a choice. She placed the marble in the box and whispered the words that would allow it to choose its own next guardian, even if that meant breaking with tradition. She had hoped, in her final days, that perhaps Tommy had inherited enough of the family gift to take on the responsibility. Back in the attic, Tommy's vision cleared. The marble's glow had subsided to a gentle pulse, like a heartbeat. He could move his fingers now, could have put it down if he wanted to, but he didn't want to. He understood now why his mother had seemed so distant throughout his childhood, why she had refused to visit Grandma Rose except on major holidays. She had been running from this responsibility, this power. But Tommy wasn't running. The memories he had seen, the knowledge that now filled his mind, told him what he needed to do. The entities behind the door were stirring, sensing the weakness in the transition of power. Already, he could feel them testing the barriers, pushing against the walls of reality. He reached into the box and found what he had somehow known would be there. A small leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with his grandmother's cramped handwriting. Instructions, rituals, the collected wisdom of generations of guardians. Something scratched at the attic window. Tommy turned to see shadows gathering outside, darker than the falling night should allow. They had forms almost human, but stretched and twisted in ways that hurt his eyes. They sensed the marble's power, sensed his yet unsteady grasp of his new role. Clutching both marble and notebook, Tommy descended from the attic. He needed to prepare. The house, his grandmother's house, now his house, had been built on a place of power. The basement held a room his grandmother had always kept locked, a room his mother had warned him never to enter. Now he knew why. The entities would come for him soon, testing his strength, probing for weaknesses. He wasn't ready, wasn't trained, wasn't even supposed to be possible if centuries of tradition were to be believed. But he was what was available, and the marble had chosen him. In the kitchen, Tommy found his phone and dialed his mother's number. She needed to know what had happened, even if she wanted no part of it herself. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Mom," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "I found Grandma Rose's memory box. I know everything now. About the Guardians, about what we protect the world from. I know why you ran from it, but I want you to know that I'm not running. I'm going to do what needs to be done. If you want to help, if you want to talk, I'm here. I'm staying in Grandma's house. And Mom, I forgive you." He ended the call and looked down at the marble in his hand. Its swirling colors had settled into a pattern he was beginning to understand. A map of sorts, showing him where the barriers between worlds were thinnest, where he would need to focus his attention. The shadows outside were growing bolder. He could hear them whispering, promising him power, knowledge, freedom from the burden he'd inherited. All he had to do was open the door, just a crack, just enough to let them show him wonders beyond imagination. Tommy smiled grimly and began drawing the protective circles his grandmother's notebook described. He was the guardian now, tradition be damned, and he had work to do. In his hand, the marble pulsed with approval, adding his first memory as guardian to its swirling collection. The moment he chose to accept his inheritance, to stand against the darkness that hungry entities would unleash upon the world. It was a good memory, strong with purpose and determination, the kind of memory that could help seal the door for another generation. Outside, the night grew darker and the whispers grew louder. But inside the house, surrounded by the power of centuries of guardians, Tommy began to learn what it meant to be a keeper of memories, a guardian of doors, a protector of the world that most people thought they knew. He was no longer just Tommy, the ordinary 32-year-old who had come to clean out his grandmother's attic. He was something more now, something necessary. And as he opened his grandmother's notebook to its first page, he knew that his real story was just beginning. Amber knew something was wrong with the grandfather clock the moment she inherited it. The ancient timepiece had stood in her grandfather's study for as long as she could remember, its steady ticking a constant backdrop to her childhood visits. But now, watching the movers carefully navigate it through her front door, the ticking seemed different, like a heartbeat growing stronger. Your grandfather was very specific in his will, the lawyer had told her, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The clock must go to you, and only you. He was quite insistent about that. The man had hesitated, then added, "He also left this envelope, to be opened only after the clock is placed in your home. Now, as the movers positioned the clock against her living room wall, Amber held the yellowed envelope in trembling fingers. The clock stood nearly 8 feet tall, crafted from dark mahogany that seemed to absorb the afternoon light. Its face was a masterwork of brass and silver, with symbols around the edges that didn't quite match any numeral she recognized. After the movers left, Amber sat cross-legged on her couch, studying the envelope. Her grandfather had been an odd man, a scholar of obscure histories and collector of strange artifacts. Her mother rarely spoke about him, except to say that he lived in a world of his own making. When Amber was young, she loved visiting his cramped Victorian house, listening to his stories about secret societies and hidden worlds that existed alongside our own. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, covered in her grandfather's precise handwriting. "My dearest Amber, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and the responsibility of the clock has passed to you. You were always my favorite grandchild. Not because you were the oldest or the smartest, but because you could see. You noticed the shadows that moved when they shouldn't, the moments when time seemed to slip sideways. The clock is not just a timepiece. It's a doorway, and more importantly, it's a lock. Every hour it strikes marks another seal holding back what lies between moments, between the ticks and the talks. There are rules you must follow. 1. Never let the clock stop. Wind it every Sunday before sunset. 2. When it strikes midnight, do not look at its face. 3. If you hear it strike 13, read the rest of this letter immediately. For now, that is all you need to know. Keep it wound. Keep it safe. And Amber, I'm sorry for the burden I've placed on you, but you were the only one strong enough to bear it. Your loving grandfather, Edmund." Amber looked up at the clock. It was 11:53 p.m. As she watched, the minute hand moved with a deliberate click, each movement feeling heavier than it should. The brass pendulum swung back and forth, its surface etched with the same strange symbols that surrounded the clock's face. At 11:59, she felt a shift in the air pressure of the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, and the temperature dropped several degrees. Amber remembered her grandfather's warning and turned away from the clock just as the first strike of midnight began. The chimes were deeper than she remembered, resonating in her chest like distant thunder. She counted them silently. 1, 2, 3. Each strike seemed to make the air thicker, harder to breathe. 4, 5, 6. The shadows were moving now. She was sure of it. 7, 8, 9. Something was whispering, just below the threshold of hearing. 10, 11, 12. Silence. Amber released the breath she'd been holding. She started to turn back toward the clock. 13. The final strike shook the house to its foundations. Amber's hands scrambled for the letter, unfolding it to the second page she hadn't noticed before. If you're reading this now, they've noticed you. The beings that live in the spaces between seconds, in the moments we miss when we blink. The clock keeps them out, but they're always looking for weaknesses, for ways to slip through. In my study, you'll find a red leather book titled Horologia Obscura. Get it now. You have until the next midnight to complete the binding ritual. Until then, do not leave the clock alone. They'll try to stop it. They'll try to distract you. Remember, what you see isn't real, but what you don't see can kill you. The key to my house is in the envelope. Amber appended the envelope, and a small brass key fell into her palm. Her grandfather's house was only 20 minutes away, but the thought of leaving the clock alone made her stomach clench. The ticking had changed again, becoming arrhythmic, like a mechanical heart struggling to maintain its rhythm. The shadows were definitely moving now, gathering in the corners like spilled ink. As she watched, they seemed to form shapes. Reaching hands, grasping fingers, faces that appeared and disappeared between one tick and the next. Her phone rang, making her jump. It was her mother. "Amber? Thank God you answered. Listen to me, don't wind that clock. Your grandfather was not well at the end. He believed things. Impossible things. The clock is dangerous. I'm coming over." Amber ended the call. She remembered the summer she turned 12, when her mother had refused to let her visit grandfather Edmund anymore. "He's feeding your imagination too much," she'd said. "You need to live in the real world." But But Amber had seen the fear in her mother's eyes, had noticed how she always avoided looking at the clock during family gatherings. The temperature dropped again. Amber's breath fogged in the air as she grabbed her car keys. The shadows were thicker now, and in their depths, she could see movement, things crawling, slithering, reaching toward the clock with limbs that bent in too many places. She ran to her car. The drive to her grandfather's house was a blur of empty streets and flickering streetlights. Every time she looked in her rearview mirror, the shadows seemed to be following, flowing like dark water just at the edge of her headlights. Her grandfather's house stood dark and silent, its Victorian architecture a black silhouette against the star-filled sky. The brass key fitted perfectly in the lock. Inside, the house smelled of old books and the lingering scent of her grandfather's pipe tobacco. The study was exactly as she remembered. Walls lined with bookshelves, strange artifacts on every surface. A stuffed raven watched her from its perch atop a globe that showed continents that never existed. She found the red leather book exactly where her grandfather said it would be. Headlights swept across the windows. Her mother's car. Amber grabbed the book and ran, making it to her car just as her mother's voice called out behind her. She didn't stop, couldn't stop. The book seemed to pulse in her lap as she drove, its pages whispering against each other with each turn. Back home, the shadows had grown bolder. They hung in thick curtains around the clock, and in their depths, Amber could see faces, hundreds of them, all screaming silently, all reaching toward the clock's face with desperate, grasping hands. She opened the book with trembling fingers. Its pages were filled with diagrams, incantations, and warnings. She found the binding ritual her grandfather had mentioned, its instructions written in both Latin and English. The clock between worlds requires a guardian, a soul to stand between moments and maintain the barrier. The current guardian's blood must be willingly given, mixed with that of the new guardian, and applied to the clock's face at the stroke of midnight. Amber's eyes went to the clock. 11:45 p.m. The shadows were pressing closer, and in their depths, she could see things moving. Things with too many eyes, too many limbs, things that existed in geometries that hurt her mind to look at. Her phone rang again. Her mother. This time, she answered. Amber, please. Her mother's voice was desperate. Don't do what he asked. You don't understand what it means, what it will cost you. I watched it destroy him, watched it take everything he was. That's why I ran. That's why I kept you away. Please, baby, please don't. You knew, Amber whispered. You knew about all of this. I was supposed to be the next guardian, but I couldn't. I wasn't strong enough. Your grandfather? He took my place, but it wasn't meant for him. The clock needs a female guardian from the bloodline. That's why. Her mother's voice broke. That's why he chose you. Because I failed. 11:50 p.m. The shadows were almost solid now, pressing against the clock like a tide of darkness. Amber could hear them whispering, promising her things, threatening her with others. I'm sorry, Mom, Amber said, but I can see them. I always could. And if I don't do this, they'll get through. She ended the call and opened the book to the ritual page. The clock's ticking grew louder, more insistent. The shadows pressed closer, and in their depths, she could see her grandfather's face, younger than she'd ever known him, nodding in approval. 11:59 p.m. Amber pricked her finger with the silver pin included in the book's binding. A drop of blood welled up, dark in the shadowed room. The clock began to strike midnight. 1. She touched her bleeding finger to the clock's face. 2. The shadows surged forward. 3. Her mother burst through the front door. 4. The shadows touched her skin, cold as death. 5. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. You were always the one who could see. 6. The room filled with impossible colors. 7. Her mother screamed. 8. Amber felt something ancient and powerful stir within the clock. 9. The shadows tried to pull her away. 10. She pressed her hand flat against the clock's face. 11. Reality bent around her. 12. Everything stopped. When Amber opened her eyes, the shadows were gone. The clock ticked steadily, its rhythm now matching her heartbeat exactly. Her mother stood frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. It's done, Amber said, and her voice seemed to echo between moments. She could feel the clock now, feel the weight of its purpose, feel the things that pressed against the barriers between seconds, testing, searching, hungry, and she could feel her own power holding them back, keeping the doors between moments firmly closed. She looked at her mother with eyes that could now see the truth of things, the ghostly imprint of what might have been, had she taken up the Guardian's mantle all those years ago. "I understand now," Amber said, "why you ran, but I won't. This is what I was meant for." The clock ticked on, marking time not just in this world, but in all the worlds that existed in the spaces between moments. Amber settled into her new role, feeling the power of generations of Guardians flowing through her blood. She was no longer just Amber. She was the keeper of moments, the guardian of time, the protector of reality's fragile barriers. And in the depths of the clock, in the space between tick and tock, the ancient entities raged and howled, knowing they had lost their chance, at least until the next guardian would be needed. But that was a worry for another time, another moment, another tick of the eternal clock. For now, Amber stood watch, as her grandfather had before her, as her grandmother had before him, as countless guardians had done since the first clock was built to hold back the chaos between moments. The ticking of the clock was steady, strong, and sure, and somewhere, in the spaces between seconds, her grandfather smiled. Sarah hadn't heard the knocking in days. After 2 weeks of constant, rhythmic tapping from within her walls, the silence felt wrong somehow, more threatening than the noise had ever been. It started the night she moved into the Victorian townhouse, a property she'd managed to snag well below market value in one of Boston's most desirable neighborhoods. The real estate agent had been suspiciously eager to close, rushing through paperwork with trembling hands. Sarah hadn't questioned it. Finding an affordable place in Beacon Hill was like winning the lottery. The first knock came as she unpacked her bedroom. 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced, emanating from somewhere inside the wall behind her antique dresser. She froze, box cutter hovering over a sealed moving carton. The sound repeated, tap, tap, tap. "Must be the pipes," she muttered, though the hollow, wooden quality of the sound suggested otherwise. Old houses made noise, that's what everyone said. She forced herself to continue unpacking, ignoring the steady percussion that continued well past midnight. But the knocking didn't stop. It followed her from room to room, always maintaining the same measured tempo, always seeming to originate from just behind the wallpaper. She tried sleeping with music playing, then with industrial-grade earplugs. Nothing could fully mask that persistent tapping. After the first week, Sarah called a plumber. He found nothing wrong with the pipes, though he did comment on the unusual thickness of the walls. "Never seen anything quite like it," he said, rapping his knuckles against the plaster, almost like there's a space between the inner and outer walls. Weird construction choice. The knocking grew louder after he left. She contacted the previous owners next, but her real estate agent informed her that the house had been empty for nearly a decade, tied up in some complicated estate dispute. The last actual residents had been the Aldrich family, elderly siblings who'd lived there together until their mysterious disappearance in 1987. By the second week, Sarah started knocking back. It began as an act of frustration. She slammed her fist against the wall one night, screaming for the noise to stop. To her shock, the tapping ceased immediately. For 30 glorious seconds, silence reigned. Then, tap, tap, tap. She knocked again, mimicking the rhythm. The unseen presence replied with the same pattern. A call and response, like some twisted version of Marco Polo. That's when the patterns began to change. The simple 3-beat rhythm evolved into more complex sequences. Sarah found herself drawn into these exchanges, spending hours trading increasingly elaborate knock patterns with whatever lurked within her walls. She told herself it was just a game, a way to maintain her sanity until she could figure out what was really going on. But then she started noticing other changes. The wallpaper began to bubble and peel in places, revealing glimpses of what looked like old newspapers stuffed between the walls. The articles she managed to read all dated from 1987, many featuring headlines about the missing Aldrich siblings. The knocking grew more insistent, almost desperate. Sometimes Sarah thought she could hear something else beneath the tapping, a muffled sound, like someone trying to speak through layers of paper and plaster. That's when she found the diary. It was tucked away in the back of a kitchen cabinet, its pages yellow with age. The cover bore the name Eleanor Aldrich in faded script. Sarah read it by candlelight that night, as the knocking provided a steady backbeat to the horrifying story that unfolded. Eleanor wrote of her younger brother Thomas's growing paranoia, his conviction that they were watching him through the walls. He began filling the spaces between the walls with newspaper, claiming it would keep them out, but his delusions only worsened. The final entry, dated 3 days before the siblings' disappearance, contained a chilling confession. Thomas says the only way to truly seal the house is from within. He's removed sections of the plaster in every room, creating spaces large enough for a person to slip inside. He says we'll be safe there, protected from their eyes. I fear what he might do if I refuse. The knocking in my head won't stop. Sarah slammed the diary shut, her hands shaking. The tapping from within the walls had ceased again, leaving that terrible, anticipatory silence. That was 3 days ago. Now, sitting in her kitchen at 3 a.m., Sarah traced her fingers along a section of wallpaper that had begun to separate from the wall, revealing a dark gap behind it. The opening looked just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The silence pressed against her eardrums like cotton wool. She found herself missing the knocking. At least that had been something tangible, something she could respond to. This silence felt like a held breath, an invitation. Sarah gripped the loose wallpaper, her heart pounding. The gap beckoned. Somewhere in the darkness beyond, she imagined she could hear the rustle of old newspapers, and perhaps, was that breathing? A new sound broke the silence. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, it came from behind her. Sarah whirled around. The kitchen was empty, but the knocking continued, now coming from multiple directions at once. The walls seemed to pulse with it, decades of layered newspapers shifting and whispering. Tap, tap, tap. She pressed her back against the wall, trying to track the sound's source. It was impossible. The knocking seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, growing louder with each repetition. Tap, tap, tap. The gap in the wallpaper widened slightly, old paper crackling like dead leaves. Sarah caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness beyond. A pale flash, like skin. Tap, tap, tap. A hand thrust through the gap, yellowed newspaper clinging to withered fingers. Sarah screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thunderous knocking that now filled the house. More hands emerged from other gaps in the wallpaper, dozens of them, reaching, grasping. The hands belonged to people, or what had once been people. Their bodies were paper-thin, compressed by decades spent between the walls, their skin the same yellowed shade as the ancient newspapers that had become fused with their flesh. Their faces were masked by pages of newsprint, headlines from 1987 still legible across their foreheads. Sarah tried to run, but the hands caught her, their touch dry and rustling. They pulled her toward the gap in the wall, which had widened into a dark maw. She caught one final glimpse of her kitchen before they dragged her into the space between the walls. A space that should have been inches wide, but somehow contained an impossible maze of narrow corridors, all lined with yellowing newspaper and filled with shuffling, paper-thin figures. The last thing she saw was a face emerging from the layers of newsprint. An elderly woman's visage, her features distorted by the headlines pressed into her skin. "Welcome home," Eleanor Aldrich whispered, her voice crackling like old paper. "We've been waiting for someone to knock back." The gap in the wallpaper sealed itself, leaving only a slight bulge to mark where Sarah had disappeared. The house fell silent once more, waiting for its next resident. For a few days, missing person posters appeared around Beacon Hill, bearing Sarah's photo and the address of the Victorian townhouse. But like the similar posters from 1987, they eventually faded and peeled away, joining the layers of paper that filled the spaces between the walls. The real estate agent listed the property again, marking down the price even further. The house would wait, collecting dust and silence, until someone new came along. Someone who wouldn't be able to resist answering that first, simple knock. Tap, tap, tap. That was the last of today's 3 haunting tales. If you want to discover more mysterious stories like these, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss our upcoming stories about mysterious guardians, cursed objects, and family secrets that should never see the light of day. Let me know in the comments which of the 3 stories impacted you the most and why. Next week, we'll be back with new stories that will keep you glued to your screen. See you in the next video.